Diagram that we see up here on the screen. Phylogenetic tree, which means it classifies things based on what? Genetics and evolution, common ancestry. According to this phylogenetic tree, what came first? Eubacteria. They branched off the chain first. Way back here. Supposedly what? The common ancestor of everything. And then the eubacteria branched off and became their own little unicellular prokaryotic cells. A little while later, archaea branched off. Why did we separate these two groups? They're different how?
In cells.
They're in different groups because they're genetically different. Yeah. They supposedly evolved from different ancestors and have different characteristics. And remember that all these things up here, these all make up what domain? Eukaryote. The eukaryotes. There are some reasons. Notice that the archaea branch of this tree is closer to the eukaryotic tree branch than it is to the eubacteria branch. What are some reasons that archaea are supposedly more related to eukarya than they are regular bacteria? A lot of their genes are more similar to our genes, eukaryotic genes, than they are regular bacteria genes. What about the way their DNA is organized? They have the histone proteins, which eukaryotes do, but bacteria don't. A lot of their enzymes are more similar to eukaryotic enzymes than they are to eubacteria enzymes. And there are a lot of other things. But in general, this is a phylogenetic tree. It shows how things have evolved from common ancestors, and things are classified based on how they're similar genetically. Today, we're going to focus mostly on this group right here. But before we do, notice that protista right there in the center of the eukaryotes. They are supposedly the first eukaryotes, correct? Protists supposedly came first. And they supposedly came into being how? How did protists supposedly come to be? Endosymbiosis. I think Rachel's going to chop down a whole tree over there on that pencil sharpener.
So slow.
Anyway, endosymbiosis, remember, supposedly a bigger prokaryote phagocytized or engulfed smaller ones. They started to live in a mutualistic kind of symbiotic relationship. And over time, those that had been engulfed supposedly became organelles, and all of a sudden you had what? A eukaryotic cell, which supposedly was a protist, a single-celled eukaryote, typically a single cell. Today, though, we're going to concentrate on fungi. Here are some characteristics of fungi. Number one, fungi are almost always multicellular. There are a couple of exceptions. I know an exception to a multicellular fungus. Do you know a unicellular example? That's what I'm asking.
Oh, no, I don't.
Yeast. Yeast, like beer, wine, that's a fungus. So yeast are an exception to that rule. We'll look at some yeast under a microscope later. Fungi obviously are eukaryotic. They have a membrane-bound nucleus with membrane-bound organelles. Fungi are heterotrophs. For a long, long time, fungi were classified in what group? Plants. It took a while for scientists to figure out they weren't capable of photosynthesis. So they got separated separately. Because, I mean, they do, and a lot of them do look sort of plant-like, right? A mushroom sort of looks like a plant. It's not green.
No, it doesn't.
They're heterotrophs. They have to get their energy from other places. They can't use sun energy. They have to eat. They do almost all have cell walls, and they're typically reinforced with chitin, which is what kind of macromolecule? Carbohydrate, similar to like cellulose or starch. Now, something that separates the fungi from a lot of things is their cells are typically haploid. What does that mean?
One set.
They have only one set of what?
Genes.
Yeah, one set of genes or one set of chromosomes in each cell. We typically are what? Diploid. Now, there's an advantage to being diploid. What's the advantage to being diploid?
That's like it's a mutate.
Yeah, well, you might get some mutations, but usually they don't show up because you've got two copies of each gene, right? And the good copy oftentimes will cover up the bad one. These have no protections like that. That's a downside of being haploid. If you have a mutation, it's going to show up, right? Because there's no backup plan. They do become diploid during sex, sexual reproduction. We'll talk about how that happens in a minute. But those are your general characteristics of fungi. Before we move off this slide, let's name some examples of fungi in general. Yeast, mushrooms, molds, lots of different kinds of mold, but mold in general. Yeah. There you go. That's the way to come in.
Watch it go.
It says, I didn't write that.
Oh, mildew.
Mildew. What's the
Not a whole lot. We got mold, mildew. Anybody eat truffles? Not the chocolate truffles, not mushroomy like truffles. No. I'll show you some more in a minute.
What is that?
What else? You guys have all seen these things that grow on the side of trees, like shelf fungi. They like stick out the side of a tree all the time. Moss is a plant, by the way. Moss is not a fungus. Now we will talk in a minute about lichens, which are the little greenish, bluish things that grow on the side of trees. It looks sort of like part of the bark, but they're greenish blue. Those are actually part fungus and part algae. It's a symbiotic kind of deal. We'll show you some pictures of those in a minute. Let's talk about some examples, though, and some characteristics. First of all, some terms you need to recognize when we talk about fungi. If we use the word saprobe, a saprobe is something that feeds on dead things. It's a decomposer. That's the fungus's main role in the environment. They're decomposers. Now, another way of saying that is saprophyte. Probably an old term. Just what do we know phyte means?
Eating.
Like a plant. So it's like a plant, but in what? Eats dead stuff. We'll refer to both of those terms when we talk about fungi. Sometimes instead of calling them heterotrophs, we'll call them one of these. Decomposers are important because they help us to recycle not just nitrogen, but minerals in general, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, they're mineral recyclers. I think I have some pictures of this in a second too. Fungi are usually made out of these thread-like chains of cells called hyphae. Thread-like chains of cells. Hyphae. Filaments. Sometimes we'll call them filaments. A lot of times if you look at any kind of fungus under a microscope, it looks like little threads going all over the place. Each of those little thread-like strands of cells is a hyphae. Actually, I think hyphae is plural. Hyphus. Okay? Yeah, it's Hyphae.
Did you make these?
Yeah, I did.
How hard is it?
I know, the font is not good on this.
I appreciate your desire to.
Yeah, I was trying to, spice it up a little bit. Yeah, another important term here. Mycelium. Now, the word mycelium can be defined several ways. First of all, it's called the body of the fungus. But what would a fungus be made, what did we just say a fungus was made out of? Hyphae. So this is like a ball of threads, a ball of hyphae. It's all the hyphae intertwined together to make the mycelium. But I will tell you, anytime in biology you see the letters M, Y, and C, sometimes O together, myco, what does that mean? It means fungus. Anytime you see those letters together, fungus. In college, I had to take 2 or 3 classes on mycology. One of the most gross classes I ever took was called medical mycology. You had to look at all kinds of human fungus diseases. And I'll show you some pictures later. No, that's a virus thing, the treatment. Anytime, though, when you see MYC or MYCO, think fungus. Means fungus. Another important thing we'll mention is what's called the fruiting body. It's kind of what it sounds like. It's the reproductive structure of a fungus. The reproductive parts. When you see what we call a mushroom, that's what you're seeing is the fruiting body. Where's most of the mushroom organism actually at? Under the ground. You're just seeing the sex organs pop up out of the ground, essentially. The rest of it's underneath. Okay? Yeah. That's what you're eating. But oftentimes, what kind of arrangement do you find mushrooms in? You kind of see them in a circle. What do they call those circles of mushrooms? Fairy rings or fairy circles? That's a pretty common term. They're in a circle. They're in a circle because where do they generally pop up? They generally pop up at the edge of the fungus's body, underneath the ground. So when you see that circle, sometimes it can be really wide. When you see that circle, you're seeing the edges of where the fungus is at oftentimes. Sometimes it can be a huge circle. You'd have to dig it. That'd be hard to find under the ground. I'll see what I can find. I don't have one on this one. I'll see what I can find. A fairy circle is like a ring of a circle of mushrooms. It's supposedly related to witches and magic, and there's no Anyway, a couple more quick terms. Hey, noise, guys. Chitin, we know, is the carbohydrate that makes up a big part of the cell walls of fungi. In plants, that material is what? Cellulose. And in eubacteria, it is peptidoglycan. That's a question on the test, by the way. Wednesday or Thursday. The material that makes up the cell walls of eubacteria. Peptidoglycan. I'll let you figure out how to spell it. Another term that'll show up occasionally in this unit is conidia. And I'm not sure you can spell it. Can read it. That's how you spell it. These are asexually produced spores. Most fungi can reproduce sexually and asexually. These are spores made through asexual means. What have we said over and over again is the big advantage of asexual reproduction? Fast. Fast way to reproduce. We said that's great as long as the environment is what? Stable, and the organism is good at living in that environment. It becomes a problem when the environment is changing, and because you don't have any what? Genetic variation, you can't what? Adapt. Evolve. Let's use that word. That's where sexual reproduction comes in. It's providing that variation. Now the fungi are grouped based on how they reproduce. We're going to talk about 4 main groups of fungi. But again, you should know They're classified based on how they reproduce, their method of reproduction. Notice that just about, well, all these names have an MYC in them. And we said that means fungus. And the part in front of that MYC refers to the shape of their reproductive structure. That first word, ascomycetes. That means sac fungus. Basidiomycetes. That means club fungus. I'm not sure in this context what deutero means. These are called imperfect because they don't seem to reproduce how? Sexually. They don't seem to reproduce sexually. They seem to be asexual.
How do you spell that second one?
Basidio, and then mycetes, mycetes.
So do we know that many words?
Yeah. And then this last group here, zygomycetes, those are called the terrestrial fungi because they're mostly found on land. Terrestrial fungi. And what we're going to do for the rest of our little talk about fungi is go in group by group, see examples, talk about how they reproduce, that kind of thing. Probably only get through the first group or two today. So ascomycetes are sac fungi, basidio are the club fungi. Basidio are things like mushrooms. Question?
Yes, are you saying, is that soaps or seeds? Like
Seeds. My seeds. C-E-T-E-S. All right, so let's start with the group that's most common, most familiar to most people, basidiomycetes. First of all, notice some examples. These are mushrooms. Some of you probably seen puffballs before. You guys know what a puffball is? Puffball, what's so unique about that word? It looks like a big spear-shaped mushroom, sort of. And if you step on it, what happens? You get this black cloud that comes out of it. And the black cloud is what? Spores. Spores. Not sperm, but sort of the same function, right? Spores. And if that puffball could think, it kind of wants you to step on it, right? Because when you step on it, what are you doing? You're spreading its spores. You're distributing them away from the parent. That's important. I've got some examples I know of puffballs here in a minute. A smut. I've got a picture of this too. Really? I'm going to do that one day though, just to see what I can make you believe, but not today. This is real today. Anybody ever picked corn out in the field before?
No.
Alright. You know what I'm talking about here, lady? Have you seen corn smut before? Alright, so you're out picking corn, and I grew up on a farm, so we would pick it, and you got some you wouldn't even have to look. You just grab and pull it, okay? To pick your corn, get fast. Every now and then you'll grab an ear of corn and you'll feel this slimy stuff all over your hand. And when you look at the ear of corn, it looks like it has this black tumor growing out of the ear of corn. A black, slimy, spore-infested tumor. That's smut. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. It doesn't really smell much. It's just gross feeling. And it makes the ear of corn inedible. I mean, you wouldn't want to eat that. I'll get there. Rust tend to be fungi that grow on grains. Like there's wheat rust, and it can ruin wheat. You wouldn't want to eat it. But these things, remember, are classified based on their method of reproduction. This thing, basidio, means club. They have this club-like club-shaped reproductive organ. It's found in what's called their gills. Where are the gills of a mushroom? Yeah, if you look under the top, if you look under the cap, it's got these little folds under there that sort of look like gills. By the way, why are a fish's gills like that? If you ever picked up a fish and kind of pulled out its operculum, you see it's got little sheets almost in its gills like the sheets of a book. Really thin, really wide, and they're there for what? Somebody said it a minute ago. Surface area, so they become better at absorbing oxygen from the water. These look very similar. They're spread out like that so they have more surface area for making spores. Babies. Exactly. Now, we usually don't call fungi male or female. We call them mating strains, and they're either plus or minus. Essentially, they're the same. They're not very different, the two. But we'll talk about how they come together. Actually, let me find a picture here to show you that. Before I get into that, these are puffballs. They can be really big, like basketball big. Can be really, really big. It's an extremely large basketball.
If I ever saw one of those, I wouldn't think it was mushroom. I would like to pick it up and try it.
That is corn smut. This big tumor-like thing right there is smut.
Why does it get there?
It's just a fungal infection. It's feeding on the corn. Alright, let's talk about this life cycle. If you understand this, you understand most of what you need to know in this PowerPoint. Now, remember, this thing called the mycelium, we said a second ago, was what? The body of the fungus. Oftentimes, the fungus reproduces asexually, which we can see over here. If it's asexual, what process is making its spores for it? It's a eukaryote, so it's mitosis, right? It's just dividing cells, making spores through mitosis. Haploid cells become haploid spores, and they just grow. Germinate just means to what? Grow. It's kind of like a seed that's sprouting, right? Spores do a similar kind of thing. This is all asexual over here. Over here, we have the sexual part. And here's the way this works. You have, what do we say these filament-like threads are called? Hyphae. You got two of those, usually one labeled plus and one labeled minus, and they happen to grow toward each other. There's probably some kind of chemical attraction going on there, right? It's got a pheromonal kind of thing or something. They grow together. Eventually, oh, it's not. Thanks. Eventually, those two cells get near each other and they fuse. They join together. That's fungus sex. Two cells fuse together. Now remember, each of those cells were what? In terms of their chromosome number. Haploid. But now all of a sudden, you had haploid over here. We call that N and N. And then all of a sudden they fuse. So this cell in the middle is 2N, which we call diploid. It's sort of like what that might happen in a human couple. That haploid plus haploid to give you diploid. What is that? What's the word I'm looking for? When that happens, that is called fertilization, correct? Haploid sperm plus haploid egg gives you diploid. What's the word for the first cell that you started at? Before that. Zygote. Haploid egg, haploid sperm, diploid zygote. I'm getting there. I'm describing a bunch of them right now. Okay? So here's what happens first. First of all, when these two hyphae meet, just their cytoplasms fuse. The fusion of their cytoplasms is called plasmogamy. Sounds like a strange word. Okay? But that's the fusion. the fusion of the cytoplasms of two fungal cells, plasmogamy. That's the beginnings of fungal sex. Fusion of cytoplasm.
Is this for all of the fungi?
Just about all of them, except that neuromycetes group.
It's not just the seed.
No, it's pretty much for all of them. All right, so plasmogamy, fusion of the cytoplasm. Now, for a short amount of time, you've got one cell with two separate what in it after this happens? Started off as two separate cells. The cytoplasms have now fused. So now it would be one cell with two different nuclei. The nucleus that started off over here and the nucleus that started over here. When it has two separate nuclei, the cell is said to be dikaryotic. Dikaryotic simply means what? Two nuclei. Karyo means nucleus. So plasmogamy, fusion of the cytoplasm, leads to a cell that has two nuclei. It's called dikaryotic. Two what kind of nuclei? Two haploid nuclei. What's going to happen a little while later is that those two haploid nuclei are going to join together. They're going to fuse. And that is called karyogamy, which literally means what? Fusion of the nuclei. That is actually more like what in us? That's fertilization. The nucleus from the sperm fuses with the nucleus from the egg. That's like karyogamy in a fungus. That leads to a diploid cell. Haploid plus haploid is diploid, right? That diploid cell then starts, first of all, it'll reproduce itself. It'll do mitosis to reproduce itself. But eventually it undergoes meiosis. What does meiosis do? Meiosis takes one diploid cell and creates from it four haploid cells. Are those cells that are made exact copies of what it started with? They are not. They're genetically different. So meiosis is going to take a diploid cell, make four haploids, but also do what to the chromosomes? Mix them up, divide them in half. And the cells that are created after meiosis become spores, haploid spores. In the fruiting body is where that would be taking place. Those spores will eventually pop out of that fruiting body through somebody stepping on it or kicking it or just the wind blowing it. Those spores will land on the ground or on a piece of bread or on an orange or wherever it may land. It'll sprout, germinate, and then we start all over again. Yeah. It can, not so much mutations, but it can lead to a cell getting extra chromosomes or missing pieces of chromosomes, which are sort of like a mutation. Yeah. Like Down syndrome, not typically. Normally a problem with meiosis is a bad thing. Usually leads to death. Back, summarizing this one more time. Start off with some hyphae. Two hyphae from two different fungi meet up, probably chemically attracted to each other through some kind of pheromonal-like chemicals. We usually call one of them plus and one of them minus. They actually join together. They hook up. We call that hooking up plasmogamy. That's when their cytoplasms fuse together. After their cytoplasms fuse, for a little while, there's one cell with two nuclei that haven't joined yet. It's called dikaryotic. Two nuclei. Eventually, those two nuclei fuse into one. Two haploids fuse together, and we get what? Two haploids, we get one diploid. The process of the nuclei fusing is called karyogamy, the joining of the nuclei, the fusion of the nuclei. And that gives us a diploid cell. That cell will undergo meiosis. Meiosis will take those chromosomes, split them back into haploids, also mix them up. So we're creating what here? What's the purpose of sex? Genetic variation. And those haploid cells that are created as a result of meiosis become spores. Those are then distributed by air, wind, whatever, germinate, grow into a brand new fungus that's genetically different than both its parents. That makes sense. That's the general sexual reproductive cycle, not of just basidiomycetes, but almost all the fungi. That's the way they work in general.
No.
No? Still working?
No. So,
Yeah.
Okay. So if this is how all the fungi do sexual reproduction, then, and the groups are split up based on how they reproduce. Is it just like a little bit?
It basically
different?
is the shape of their reproductive structure.
What's-
What their reproductive structure looks like is really what it's.
Okay, so it's not.
This is basically the same, just their organs look a
Okay,
little bit
because I
different.
wrote method of reproduction.
Well, yeah, that's typically how it's
Yeah.
expressed, but really it's more the shape of their reproductive structure. Okay, let me backtrack. I think we covered pretty much all of this stuff, our different mating strains, plus and minus. That's just sort of in terms describing the picture we just looked at. So really nothing new there. There's some mushrooms. One thing you want to be careful of. Some mushrooms are highly toxic, correct? You do not want to go out in the woods, pick mushrooms, and come home and eat them. That's always a bad idea. There was a couple in Texas a few years back, it was a family, decided they were going to make spaghetti. So they went on this outing to pick mushrooms for their spaghetti. They had a book that, they were looking at the book of poisonous, non-poisonous mushrooms. They thought they were picking non-poisonous ones. Turns out the poisonous ones and the non-poisonous ones look a whole lot alike. And unless you really know what you're doing, you can't tell them apart. So they ate the spaghetti with just had a few mushrooms in it, not a big deal, you would think. But I think 2 of the people in the family died, and 1 or 2 had to have liver transplants. Because what's the liver do? Filters out poisons. So it wiped out their livers. Yeah. Let's see if I have time. Let's talk about this for a minute. I have a friend who used to work here, Sergeant Major, who used to be the ROTC guy. He grows mushrooms, sells them to like grocery stores and restaurants. How would you do that?
You probably notice which ones are.
You have to like
Use them like
get
a-
the ones that are already living and like get dead
Get it all
stuff and then
Get your mushrooms.
grow more.
I don't know. First of all, where are you more likely to find fungi? What kind of environment?
Moist.
Moist, dark, warm. They like moist, dark, warm. That's where you're usually going to find fungi. A lot of times you have an old-fashioned shower curtain. If you're not careful and you don't clean it with like bleachy cleaners, you'll see mildew growing on the bottom of it because it's warm and wet and dark a lot of times. You'll find them growing on the shower cord. Well, it happens all the time in third place. Anyway, the way that he grows these mushrooms, he takes just pieces of wood, logs, drills holes in the logs. I guess he purchases the spores from someplace, I don't know, but he gets mushroom spores, pours them in these little holes in the logs, hot glues the holes shut, wets down the logs. He keeps them in this heated room, so it's like a sauna almost. It's hot and damp. No. Hot and damp, and these mushrooms just ever so often pop up out of the logs, and he just goes in, picks them, and sells them by the pound to restaurants and things. Now here's the thing though. Most of the actual fungus is where? In the log. And what he's picking off are just the reproductive parts, and that's what you eat. Fungus reproductive organs. Yummy, right? That's what you're eating when you're eating mushrooms. Yes.
He has a license for that?
I don't know. That's what she has. I don't know. I'm sure he probably has to have some kind of license, but it's not that difficult to do. Yeah. He may actually take spores from the mushrooms he already has. I'm not sure, but eventually they're going to eat away the logs. So when the logs are eaten away, he has to replace them with new ones. I don't know how long it takes. I haven't seen the actual search. We will briefly mention this last group, the second group rather, Ascomycetes. And Ascus, A-S-C-O, or A-S-C-U-S is the singular version of that, is a sac-like reproductive organ. Now a lot of these you've probably heard of before. Yeast, obviously, you've heard of. Anybody know what Candida albicans is?
Yeah.
That's a scientific name. I'm going to bet a lot of people in here have been infected with them. These are the yeast that cause things like yeast infections. These are also the yeast, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, which some of you guys have probably had. Guys and girls. As children especially, you can get yeast infections in your throat. Anybody know what you call that? It's called thrush. And you get this white, like pasty growth all over your throat and the roof of your mouth. I will show you a picture of that. A couple of other things. This one right here, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. What does Saccharomyces sound like? Sugar fungus. These are the fungi involved in fermenting sugar. These are the yeast that are used to make what? Yeah, beer, wine, homemade bread, stuff like that. Now a couple of other things that I will briefly mention here. Truffles. These are not the little chocolate truffles you buy in the grocery store. These are mushroom-like things that grow under the ground that are hundreds of dollars per pound. They're very expensive. They're a delicacy, especially in Europe. They actually train what animal to find them under the ground? Pigs. They have pigs that smell them out and dig them up. I'll show you a truffle. It doesn't look very appetizing to me. And also penicillium, the fungus that makes penicillin, belongs in this group.
I'm allergic to that. Am I allergic to everything?
Everything.
I don't get where you're going with that question.
Someone's in that group, right?
No. You're just allergic to one particular protein made by that fungus. Penicillin. Yes.
Was it the stem that we were relying on?
They found it growing, the fungus growing in a dish, a petri dish of bacteria, and around the mold, all the bacteria were dying. So Alexander Fleming figured out, hey, something's going on here, and eventually we isolated penicillin. Kind of happened by accident. It's a good thing. Maybe the most important discovery of all time. Those are truffles. It sort of looks like dog poop on rice to me, right?
$1 per pound.
You had to pay
Several $100s per pound. I've heard it tastes sort of like butter.
butter.
Yeah. It's like a mushroom. This picture here is just a picture of brewer's yeast, the yeast that used to make beer and stuff. Each one of these little sphere-like things is a separate one-celled yeast. Remember, they're single-celled. Here's a life cycle kind of thing of this particular kind of fungus. We'll walk through this and we'll call it a day. you're going to see that this is essentially the same as the last one we talked about. You got two strains of fungi, two mating types, plus and minus. These little hyphae will eventually fuse together. When they fuse, that's called plasmogamy, fusion of cytoplasm. That will lead to cells that are dikaryotic, single cell with two nuclei. Eventually, those two nuclei will join together, a process called karyogamy. That will produce a diploid cell, kind of like a zygote. In you, after the zygote happens, what does that zygote start to do really fast? Yeah, but what helps it to do that? What's the process? You start with one cell, and very quickly you have lots of cells. What process does that? Mitosis. Now, in fungi, before mitosis, you first get what? That diploid cell first goes through what process of cell division? Meiosis. In meiosis, one diploid cell quickly forms four haploid cells. You see that up here, right?
Yes.
But notice those four quickly become eight. How do four become eight? Each of those four, after meiosis, also does mitosis. And notice that these spores are enclosed in a sac-like structure. And what word did we say means sac? Ascus or asco. That's why they're called ascomycetes. They make their spores in sacs. These will burst open, pop out, get blown around in the wind, land on the ground, germinate, and that's where we get a new fungus and it all starts over again. But again, we have plasmogamy leading to a dikaryotic cell or hyphae. The nuclei in there fuse, that's called karyogamy. That gets followed up by meiosis, and then a little bit of mitosis. Now we got spores. Those go out, germinate, and the cycle starts all over again. We will pick up from there next time. That's a good question. I don't know.